The sky above Zyphar 9 was a ruin of fire and smoke, torn apart by energy blasts and the burning husks of fallen warships. The Coalition's stronghold, once a bastion of resistance, now smoldered under the relentless assault of the Zelvar. General Cale Thorne stood at the command center's shattered viewport, jaw clenched as he watched his forces collapse. Every screen in the room flickered with distress calls, tactical readouts, and casualty reports. None of them good. The war was lost. General, our western perimeter has been breached. The voice of Major Runholm barely concealed the weight of impending defeat. Zelvar shock troops have entered the inner city. We won't hold for more than an hour. Thorne exhaled sharply, pressing both hands onto the holodable. The Zelvar had dismantled every strategy, countered every last-ditch maneuver. Their biomechanical warriors moved with an efficiency that made resistance feel meaningless. His best officers were dead, their fleet shattered. The few survivors were clinging to ruins, buying minutes at the cost of lives. A deep, guttural transmission crackled over the comms. Coalition forces. The Zelvar warlord's voice slithered through the speakers. Your struggle is over. Surrender, and we will grant you mercy. Thorne's fist tightened. The Zelvar did not offer mercy. Surrender meant mass executions, enslavement, or worse. He had seen the aftermath of their so-called victories. Planets stripped of their populations, their cultures erased. He turned toward the remaining officers, most battle-worn and bloodied. We hold, he said, voice like iron. We fight to the last man. No one argued. There was nothing left to say. Outside, the city burned. A squad of coalition soldiers took position along a collapsed barricade, their rifles trained on the encroaching darkness. Lieutenant Harrow wiped blood from his forehead, his grip steady despite the trembling ground. Make your shots count, he murmured to his men. We don't get another chance. A moment later, the night erupted in flashes of gunfire and the alien howls of the advancing Zelvar. The Coalition defenders fought with everything they had, but it was not enough. For every Zelvar they put down, 3 more surged forward, their armored forms weaving through the wreckage with unnatural grace. One of Harrow's men was pulled screaming into the shadows. Another's body hit the rubble, lifeless. The command center shook as an explosion rocked the upper floors. Dust rained from the ceiling, lights flickering as systems failed. A young officer stumbled toward Thorne, panic clear in his wide eyes. General, communications are down. We've lost contact with the outer defense teams. Thorne barely heard him. His gaze was fixed on the sky, where something new had entered the battle. At first, it was just a shadow against the stars, dark, enormous, unrelenting. Then came the signatures. Dozens of them, no, hundreds, slipping from hyperspace with the precision of a blade carving through flesh. The Coalition had no remaining fleets. The Zelvar had no reinforcements. That left only one possibility: humans. The realization spread like wildfire through the command center. The officers who had stood on the precipice of despair now stared at the displays with something bordering on hope or fear. A single transmission cut through the static, its signal crisp, devoid of emotion. This is Admiral Darius Locke of the Terran Dominion. Stand by. No embellishment, no pleasantries, just a statement absolute and final. Thorne could do nothing but watch as the black warships of humanity descended. The Zelvar, so confident in their victory, had turned their attention skyward. Their fleets repositioned. Their war machines hesitated. Then the humans opened fire. There was no warning, no demand for surrender, no negotiation. A Zelvar battleship, large enough to blot out the horizon, was split in 2 within seconds. The humans had no interest in drawn-out engagements. They fought with brutal efficiency, targeting command nodes, severing supply lines, cutting down their enemies before they could react. Within moments, the balance of the battle shifted. The Zelvar, for the first time in recorded history, were being driven back. Their warlord's voice returned to the comms, but now there was something else beneath the arrogance: uncertainty. "Terrans," HFY growled, "you do not belong in this war." Admiral Locke's response was swift: "We do now." On the ground, the remaining coalition soldiers watched in stunned silence as drop pods slammed into the battlefield, scattering debris like shrapnel. Out of them emerged the human infantry, tall, armored figures moving with the precision of machines, but the ferocity of something far more primal. Captain Marcus Voss led the charge. His weapon fired in controlled bursts, each shot finding a target, each movement efficient, unrelenting. The Zelvar, creatures bred for war, found themselves on the receiving end of a kind of violence they did not understand. Humans did not fight for survival. They fought for total destruction. The battle turned into a slaughter. Thorn barely recognized what he was seeing. The Zelvar were a force that had crushed world after world. Yet here they were, falling, breaking, retreating. He looked toward the main display, where the human fleet continued its brutal onslaught, and for the first time, he wondered if the coalition had made a mistake. Not in calling for help, but in unleashing something far worse. The silence that followed the initial human bombardment was not relief. It was a vacuum, an absence of sound that seemed unnatural after hours of relentless slaughter. The coalition's remaining forces clung to their crumbling defenses, waiting, watching. General Cale Thorne stood at the edge of the ruined command center, his gaze locked on the burning horizon. The sky, once dominated by the grotesque silhouettes of Zelvar warships, now belonged to something else. A fleet unlike anything Zyphar 9 had ever seen loomed above them. Sleek, angular warships as black as a void hung motionless, their hulls unmarked by battle. They had struck with terrifying efficiency, disabling Zelvar command vessels before their enemies had even registered their arrival. Now, the battlefield was still, and the Zelvar, for the first time in history, hesitated. A sharp beep from the comms terminal signaled an incoming transmission. Coalition officers turned toward Thorne uncertain. He pressed the control panel. A crisp, unwavering voice filled the room. "This is Admiral Darius Locke of the Terran Dominion. We are assuming control of this engagement. Assuming control. Not offering aid. Not pledging allegiance." Thorne felt a flicker of unease. He had called for help, but now he wondered if he had invited something far worse than the Zelvar. Before he could respond, a thunderous explosion split the sky. From the lead Terran warship, beams of concentrated energy lanced through the remaining Zelvar vessels, cutting through their armor like molten knives through ice. The Zelvar, once the architects of devastation, now flailed in disarray. Their warlord, HFY, attempted to coordinate a counteroffensive, but every maneuver was anticipated. Every formation shattered before it could solidify. Then the drop pods came. Dozens of metal capsules broke away from the Terran fleet, streaking through the atmosphere like meteorites. They struck the ground with seismic force, cracking pavement, collapsing structures already weakened by battle. Before the dust settled, the pods burst open, and from their steel tombs emerged the soldiers of the Terran Dominion. They were not like the coalition troops. Their armor was heavier, reinforced with plating that bore no insignia of rank or allegiance, only efficiency. Their weapons were compact, streamlined, yet carried an air of finality. They moved with an eerie precision, sweeping the battlefield with practiced lethality. At the forefront was Captain Marcus Voss. He stepped from his drop pod with the ease of a man exiting a vehicle, unshaken by the chaos around him. His visor scanned the field, analyzing heat signatures, mapping enemy positions before they could react. The Zelvar still outnumbered them, but numbers had ceased to matter the moment humanity arrived. A Zelvar warrior lunged from the ruins, its plasma blades igniting in a brilliant arc. Voss turned, fired a single shot, and moved on without breaking stride. The alien collapsed, a perfectly placed hole burned through its skull. The rest of the Dominion forces followed suit. Their strategy was not defense, not attrition. It was extermination. They moved through the battlefield like a storm, their weapons tearing through Zelvar ranks with brutal efficiency. Coalition soldiers, battered and bloodied, could do nothing but watch. Sergeant Cole Rayner's squad had been pinned down for hours, reduced to their last magazines, their last reserves of strength. He had resigned himself to death, to the cold inevitability of the Zelvar's advance. Then, out of nowhere, the Terrans arrived. He barely had time to register them before the air filled with the sound of suppressed gunfire. The Zelvar that had been closing in on his position fell in rapid succession, each shot delivered with clinical precision. A towering figure in dark armor knelt beside him, barely sparing him a glance. "On your feet, Sergeant." Rayner obeyed instinctively, recognizing authority when he heard it. He expected an order, a battle plan, something, but the Terran had already moved on, pressing forward with his squad as if Rayner and his men were little more than an afterthought. It took Rayner several seconds to understand. The Terrans hadn't come to reinforce the coalition. They had come to replace them. At the heart of the battlefield, our white HFY snarled. This was not how it was meant to be. His people had crushed world after world, bending entire civilizations to their will. Yet here they stood, on the edge of annihilation, not by the coalition they had long considered weak, but by something far worse. He opened a direct channel to the Terran flagship. "Terrans," he growled, forcing every syllable through his mandibles. "You do not belong in this war." Admiral Locke's voice came through immediately, cold and measured. "We do now." The transmission cut, and a new wave of human forces entered the fray. Thorne watched from the command center, his mind racing. He had fought for survival, for the preservation of the coalition, but these men, these soldiers, they fought for something else. There was no desperation in their movements, no fear, no hesitation. They had entered the war not to win it, but to end it. He turned back to the comms, knowing he had only one choice. The humans had assumed control. Now, all he could do was hope they had reason to stop before there was nothing left. The battlefield had transformed into something unrecognizable. Where once the Zelvar had marched in perfect formation, overwhelming every coalition stronghold with ruthless efficiency, now their ranks were broken, scattered like dead leaves before a storm. The humans moved through the ruined streets of Zyphar 9 without hesitation, without mercy. Every engagement ended the same, swift, precise, absolute. Captain Marcus Voss led his unit through the shattered remains of what had once been the coalition's western defense perimeter. Bodies littered the ground, a mixture of human and alien, but the tide of battle had shifted. The Zelvar, a species bred for war, now found themselves outmatched, not in numbers but in sheer brutality. They had underestimated humanity. Voss stepped over the corpse of a Zelvar officer, its armor still smoldering from an incendiary round. His squad moved in silence, their rifles trained on the shadows, their movements mechanical. The Dominion did not waste words. Orders were understood before they were spoken. A gesture, a nod, the flicker of a targeting reticle. These were the only signals needed. Ahead, a Zelvar squad had taken cover behind the remains of a collapsed transport vehicle, their plasma rifles glowing in the dim light. One of them, a commander by the markings on its armor, barked orders in its guttural language. They were regrouping, preparing for a counterattack. Voss did not give them the chance. With a single-hand signal, his men fanned out. Suppressed gunfire filled the air, precise and devastating. The first alien barely had time to react before its skull burst apart, the impact of a hyper-accelerated round snapping its head back. Another was cut down mid-motion, its plasma rifle discharging harmlessly into the dirt as it collapsed. The Zelvar commander turned, mandibles flaring in defiance. Then Voss put a bullet through its chest, center mass, and moved on. The engagement lasted less than 5 seconds. Sergeant Cole Rayner watched from a distance, gripping his own rifle with white-knuckled hands. He had fought alongside hardened coalition veterans, men and women who had seen countless battles. But this was something else. The Terrans did not fight for survival. They fought for annihilation. Sir, one of Voss's soldiers called over comms. Enemy transmissions intercepted. The Zelvar are pulling back. Looks like they're trying to regroup near the southern ridge. Voss didn't break stride. Then we don't let them. The Terran advance did not slow. Wherever the Zelvar retreated, they were hunted down. There was no hesitation, no wasted movement. The humans fought with a purpose that went beyond reclaiming lost ground. They were eradicating the enemy. From the ruined command center, General Cale Thorne observed the battle through flickering holodisplays. His own soldiers had stopped fighting, not from cowardice but from shock. The Coalition had battled the Zelvar for years, always on the back foot, always bleeding for every inch of ground. Now, in mere hours, humanity had turned the war on its head. General, a weary voice called from behind. Thorne turned to see Major Renholm, his uniform torn, blood smeared across his cheek. We just received another transmission from the Zelvar warlord. They're demanding terms of surrender. Surrender. Thorne felt his breath catch. The Zelvar did not surrender. They fought until there was nothing left, until every last soldier had been spent. And yet, here they were, breaking, faltering beneath the weight of something they could not comprehend. The display flickered, and the alien warlord's face appeared. HFY, the once feared conqueror of a dozen worlds. His exoskeletal plating was cracked. His four glowing eyes filled with something Thorne had never seen in their kind. Fear. You have won? HFY admitted, his voice lacking the usual venom. We offer surrender. Spare what remains of our forces, and we will withdraw from this system. We will never return. Thorne turned his gaze to the Terran warships still looming in the sky, their weapon systems glowing ominously. The humans had not responded to the surrender. They had not even acknowledged it. He reopened the comms. Admiral Locke, the Zelvar have offered their surrender. There was a pause, a silence that stretched too long. Then, the Admiral's voice came through, cold and final. Unacceptable. The word hit like a hammer. Thorne's stomach twisted. They're beaten, Admiral. We've won. There's no need for... We do not negotiate with butchers, Locke interrupted. They will receive no mercy. This war ends today. The transmission cut and the sky ignited. The Terran fleet opened fire once more, not at strategic targets, not at military installations, but at everything. Thorne watched in horror as the bombardment began. The Zelvar, already in retreat, were cut down without hesitation. Their ships, already disabled, were torn apart, their crews incinerated. On the ground, Voss and his soldiers moved through what remained of the enemy ranks, eliminating survivors without a second thought. There were no prisoners, no broadcast of surrender, only execution. Sergeant Rayner turned to Voss, his voice hoarse. They're giving up. You see that, right? We don't have to do this. Voss did not look at him. We do. The last remnants of the Zelvar forces fell before them, and still, the Terrans pressed on. The wrath of humanity was not a battle. It was a reckoning. Thorne clenched his fists. This was not the victory he had hoped for. This was something else entirely. Something monstrous. The screams of the dying had faded, replaced by the mechanical hum of Terran war machines moving through the rubble. Smoke clung to the air, thick with the acrid stench of burning metal and flesh. The Zelvar were gone. What remained of them were little more than lifeless husks, scattered across the ruined battlefield like discarded remnants of a forgotten war. The humans had done what the Coalition never could. They had ended the war, but it did not feel like victory. General Cale Thorne stood at the edge of a shattered overpass, his gaze locked onto the black-armored soldiers patrolling below. They moved with calculated precision, scanning the ruins for any remaining Zelvar survivors. There would be none. The Dominion had made sure of that. He had once believed humanity's arrival would turn the tide, that they would bring salvation. Now he realized they had only brought extermination. A sudden transmission crackled in his earpiece. General, the Dominion is advancing toward the lower city. There's nothing left to fight. The voice on the other end belonged to Major Runholm, but it was strained, uncertain. They're still moving forward. Orders. Thorne had no orders to give. This wasn't his army. This wasn't even his war anymore. The coalition had been swept aside, rendered irrelevant in the face of humanity's ruthless efficiency. He had pleaded for the Zelvar's surrender, had hoped for an end to the bloodshed. But Admiral Locke had made his position clear. There would be no mercy. Captain Marcus Voss led the next wave of Dominion soldiers into the lower city, his visor reflecting the dying embers of Zyphar 9. His squad moved in formation, boots crunching over debris, rifles at the ready. They encountered no resistance. The war was over, yet their orders had not changed. Ahead, a group of Zelvar civilians huddled in the wreckage of a collapsed structure. They were smaller than their warriors, their exoskeletal plating thinner, their clawed hands gripping one another in fear. They had not fled with the rest. Perhaps they had been left behind. Perhaps they had simply accepted their fate. One of Voss's men, Lieutenant Garrick, raised his rifle. "Orders, Captain." There was no hesitation in Voss's voice. "No survivors." Sergeant Cole Rayner took a step forward, his pulse hammering. "They're civilians," he said, voice low, controlled. "They're unarmed." Voss turned his head slightly, regarding Rayner with an unreadable expression. And Rayner's grip tightened on his rifle. "We've won. This isn't war anymore. It's slaughter." Garrett glanced between them, his finger hovering over the trigger. The civilians did not move, did not speak. They had seen what had become of their warriors. They knew what was coming. Voss exhaled, slow and measured. "This war didn't start with us, Sergeant, but we're the ones who will end it. No mercy, no retreat." Rayner took a step forward, putting himself between his squad and the terrified aliens. "I won't do this." For the first time since their arrival, Voss hesitated, his visor tilted slightly, as if weighing Rayner's words, measuring their worth. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken consequences. Then, without warning, Voss raised his sidearm and fired. The civilians fell in an instant, their bodies crumpling into the dust. Rayner flinched, not at the sound of the shot, but at the finality of it. A single, efficient execution. No hesitation. No remorse. Voss holstered his weapon. "You're relieved of duty, Sergeant." Rayner stared at him, fury twisting in his gut, but he said nothing. There was nothing to say. The Dominion pressed forward. Buildings collapsed beneath the weight of their advance, their warships circling overhead like vultures over a carcass. What little remained of Zyphar 9 would soon be wiped from existence, its history erased beneath the boot of human dominance. In the command center, Thorne watched the carnage unfold in silence. He had fought too long, lost too much, to believe in the illusion of victory anymore. This was not liberation. This was extermination. And the worst part, the most terrifying part, was that he knew deep down the war had never truly been about the Zelvar. This was who humanity was. And now, the galaxy would know it too. The fires of Zyphar 9 burned long into the night, their orange glow casting twisted shadows across the ruins. The once thriving world was now little more than a graveyard, its people erased, its history reduced to ash. Above, Terran warships hovered like silent sentinels, their guns still hot from the bombardment. There was no celebration, no banners raised in victory, only the methodical hum of machinery, the quiet efficiency of a species that had come not to conquer, but to destroy. General Cale Thorne stood in the shattered remains of the Coalition's former command center, staring at the flickering holo displays. The Zelvar homeworld had gone dark. No transmissions, no distress calls. The Dominion's campaign had been swift, merciless. What had taken the Coalition years of bloodshed to barely resist, humanity had undone in weeks. Entire fleets dismantled, colonies wiped from the stars, resistance crushed before it could even form. The war had not just been won, it had been erased. A heavy silence filled the room. Thorn was not alone. Admiral Locke stood near the observation window, arms clasped behind his back. His expression, as always, was unreadable. Beneath the harsh glow of the displays, his face seemed carved from stone, impervious to doubt or regret. "It's done," Thorn said, his voice hollow. Locke did not turn. Almost. Thorn frowned. They surrendered. They begged for their lives. And yet, we are still here. Locke gestured toward the burning city below. "Tell me, General, do you know what happens after a war is won?" Thorn's hands curled into fists. "Reconstruction. Peace." Locke exhaled a slow, deliberate sound. "You still don't understand." He turned, finally meeting Thorn's gaze. "We are not here to rebuild. We are not here to make peace. The Dominion does not wage war to end it. We wage war because it is what we are." Thorn took a step forward, his body rigid. "You came to save us." Locke let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "Did we?" Outside, soldiers moved through the rubble with clinical precision, their armor reflecting the glow of burning ruins. There were no civilians left to corral, no prisoners to take. Just bodies and the steady, unrelenting march of the victors. A sharp knock echoed from the entrance. A Dominion officer stepped forward, saluting crisply. "Admiral, the remaining coalition leaders are requesting an audience. They want terms." Thorn felt a flicker of hope. The war was over. Perhaps, even now, something could be salvaged. "Then let's hear them." But Locke only shook his head. "There are no terms." Thorn stiffened. "You mean to execute them?" Locke's expression did not change. "They were weak enough to need saving. That alone is a crime." Something inside Thorn cracked. "You don't get to decide that." Locke tilted his head slightly, studying him. "Who will stop us?" Thorn opened his mouth, but no words came, because there was no answer. The Dominion had proven itself unstoppable. The Zelvar were gone. The coalition was broken. The galaxy had bent the knee, not to diplomacy, but to the inevitability of human dominance. A slow, suffocating realization settled over him. The Zelvar had never been the true enemy. Humanity had come, not as saviors, but as executioners. They had not sought to free the oppressed. They had sought to erase all who opposed them. And when the last alien world fell silent, when the final coalition leader was buried beneath the weight of his failure, the Dominion would not stop, because war was not their means. It was their purpose. Thorn turned away from Locke, from the warships, from the city they had raised beyond recognition. His hands trembled at his sides. He had spent his life believing in heroes, in the struggle for justice, in the dream that war had an end. Now, he understood the truth. Humanity's war would never end, because this was their true nature.